What do we understand by the term nationalism? So nationalism is the concept of the pride that we feel towards our nation. This nation binds us through various factors. What are those factors? So this nation that we belong to binds us by various factors like that of language, history, territory, or in fact religion and various ethnicities. We see that all these factors are the reason why the people living in a nation feel like they are one, they are united. But India did not have this sense of nation or nationhood in its early stages. The nation state concept came much later. Though India had a pretty continuous territory, it did not have the idea of the nation because of various regional identities that resided in it. It only came after the British came in India that the Indians were able to realize the true nationhood and their identity as one, as Indians. This entire factor of building the identity as Indians gave the impetus for the growth of nationalism and various nationalist factors in India. So let's learn about the same. When the Madras famine was raging in India, we saw Lord Lytton, who was a British official and the then Viceroy of India, held the Grand Indian Darbar. The Grand Darbar was held for the Queen's proclamation of becoming the Indian Empress, and we saw that the grand banquet was held for the same. So you can very well understand that at this point of time, when on one side India is in extreme clutches of poverty and debt, the Britishers, the British colonizers are celebrating the crown's gain of power over the colony. So we can very well understand how concerned the colonizers were for their colony and the masses that resided in it. Now, it is not unknown to us that the idea of the British colonizers for the colonies was that it was bent towards extreme revenue extraction. So ideally, the reason why in fact colonialism happened was to generate revenue for the European colonizers. And when British in fact colonized India, we see that their capitalist mindset was such that they wanted to extract and suck out the most amount of revenue that they could from India. Now, not only were their economic ideas and ideals, repressive towards the Indians, but also they were exploitative to a level where Indians failed to keep up with the economic policies, which created a number of problems in the society for the Indians at that point of time, who were day by day going into the clutches of poverty. So we can see the various economic factors that constantly provoked the Indian masses to go against the British. First was of course the oppressive British revenue policies. Now, like we were discussing, that the British were ideally driven towards the factor of revenue generation, and they only wanted to suck out as much revenue as possible, not giving any heed to what progress India was making. Now we see that peasants often found it difficult to meet the revenue demands and borrowed money from the moneylenders. Now, we clearly have discussed the fact that the British economic policies of land use were so exploitative in nature because it, levied such heavy taxes on the peasants, which the peasants weren't they weren't able to fulfill. They were not able to give those taxes. Now, when they could not give those taxes, taxes, there was an amount of punishment. And that punishment would include the peasants being separated from their land holdings, where the land holdings would directly go to the British colonizers. Now, in order to protect themselves from losing their lands, what happened was the peasants ended up money lending from the big money lenders who were there and gave away the loans, the taxes that they were supposed to pay to the British. But in doing so, they were stuck deep in debt. Now, at one point of time, we see that these peasants who are trying to pay up the taxes are money lending constantly and paying up the taxes. So, in turn, what would happen is there would automatically a creation of a burdensome loan on the peasants that they were unable to pay off. So we see that their lands were being taken away if there was a failure of revenue payment. So ideally, because it was only revenue generation that the capitalists had in mind, these people did not regard the peasants as people who also needed to generate their own livelihood, the food grains that need to come in order to feed them. So once the taxes were not paid, immediately the land holdings would be taken away. Now what instantly happened as a result of this was that anyway there were certain crops and products that the British colonizers made it absolutely important to grow, like that of tobacco, like that of indigo, jute, that the colonizers wanted to export. But when food grains weren't given importance and the land holdings were being taken away, we directly see that there is a loss of food grains in the society, and the society is not only dealing with grappling poverty but also hunger. So this hunger ultimately created a dire state when the famine occurred in India. Now, economic policies were not only exploitative towards the land use and the way the British colonizers treated the peasants, but these economic policies were exploitative in the sense that the British entirely were focused upon gaining primarily from India as a colony and also destroying India's own businesses. So we see that the policy of export of raw materials and import of machine-made British goods provided a heavy competition to Indian handicrafts. Now, we already know that before the British came in, India could sustain itself because it had its own markets and its own market policies and industries. Now, when British colonizers came in, they were not only taking away raw materials from India without any import duties on them, but also they were bringing in the machine-made products from Britain and flooding the Indian markets. So automatically these were readily available. They were made cheaper for the people here in the markets, and the handicrafts automatically lost their market to the machine-made products coming from Britain. So the free trade policy of the British failed to protect interest of Indian artisan and craftsmen. Now, when they are taking away raw materials duty free, we also see that they are exporting materials from Britain duty free, as in neither are they paying for the imports nor are they paying for the exports in the to and fro from the colonies. So the idea of this free trade automatically destroyed the chain of economy that these Indian handicrafts had, because when Indian handicrafts were being priorly traded, they used to bring in an amount of export duties that India received as its economic gain. So India automatically lost that market for any revenue generation for itself. We see that the fall in demand of Indian goods and the inability to make interests out of exports led to de-industrialization. Now, here not only were the demands for Indian goods destroyed, but when there was no particular revenue generation in creation of the products, automatically the products now were diminishing. So Indian handicrafts were in the verge of extinction at one point of time, when British injected the British products to a level in the Indian markets when Indian handicrafts and its own products could not gain a place. So we see that there is this process of de-industrialization, of destruction of homegrown Indian industries that India as a society, economic society, was going through. So we can very well in fact state that British created the de-industrialization phase, and this was an entirely man-made phase. Now you might have a question as to why was de-industrialization done.
Now, the British could have just come and sold their products in the colonial markets, but that would not serve their purpose. If they would have allowed the Indian products to stay in the markets, they would be sold at much cheaper rates and prices, which would pose a stiff competition to the British goods, thus ultimately bringing down the revenue on the part of the British. Thus, we see that this entire de-industrialization factor was brought in so that the British could maintain a monopoly in these colonial markets. Now, what did this phase of de-industrialization do? They brought many artisans and craftsmen into the cusp of poverty, and thus they became jobless.
The third factor that primarily showed its face as a very decisive economic policy was that when Britain was facing industrial revolution and created such machine-made products with no time, Britain also wanted to make its governance easier in the colonies. So what it did was it brought industrial changes in the colonies as well. So we see that India is also coming in terms with the Western ideas of industrialization. And when these modern industries are being developed in India, that is creating an Indian working class.
Now, this Indian working class grew up around the industries that were in the urban areas, in the towns and cities. And these, people of the working class who lived in these urban spaces ultimately became the urban poor because of the low wages, the poor wages that were paid to them, and the poor living conditions that they lived in.
So we see that these working classes worked in the factories and mines in India that were quickly coming up. So you can understand that the British now wanted to create not only a market for themselves in India, but also a production base for themselves in India, where Indian people would be appointed to work in less wages
as cheap labor.
So we see that the working conditions were very poor and they were exploited by their owners. So the situation was not very different from that of Britain. The workers who were working in Britain were in poor living conditions, poor working conditions, poor wage conditions, and so were the Indian workers. So the working class primarily, was being exploited continuously by the owners and by the colonizers. Now, there was therefore a constant, competition that the British colonizers were taking ahead. Now, you might think that in a competition we expect a fair play, but that fair play could not be expected from the Britishers, because the entire ideology of the Britishers was to cripple the Indian masses, to cripple the Indian economy. So in order to do that, not only did it drain wealth from India, but also it was aiming to close all doors for India where it could generate an economy of itself. So the other aspect here is that we see, Indian people who wanted to compete and get into British governmental services, they weren't allowed to do that. So there was a discrimination on the basis of race, there was a discrimination on the basis of class, because working class was also being exploited repeatedly. So we see that this discrimination resulted in a very stiff competition where Indians constantly tried to get hold of the posts in these governmental services, in the British government services, but they weren't able to. So in this very picture you can see this is the last batch of the Indian civil service, where Indians were taken in for the services of the British government, but that was not the case in the beginning, leading to competition for Indian seats. Now in the beginning the seats were so less that they could not, the number of people who competed and the number of people who got the seats was not in any kind of fair ratio. Thus we understand that the educated class was also struggling to earn a livelihood. It was not just the working classes. We saw that educated classes fought against each other for job in governmental services. Now the larger section of the people remained unemployed, only a few got selected. So the ratio, as we were discussing, was not something that was at par to each other. The work pressure was excessive, but the salaries paid were very low. Now, constantly we are referring to the fact that the British colonizers did not want any aspect of revenue to shine on India. So these people, even if they are taking in Indian laborers, Indian people to get appointed in the governmental services, they weren't paying them as much as an English man was receiving. Now not only was work pressure more and salaries less, but there was no idea of incentives as well as no scope to promote themselves. So the scope of promotion was negligible. So it wasn't even there that a person who is appointed as a junior officer will move to a senior officer, because as we have seen that all the senior official positions were reserved for Englishmen only. Thus we saw that all these classes, whether it was the peasants, the working class, the artisans, or the educated classes, all of them were now really angry with the British policies, and all of these classes were grappling with the problems that these policies created, and the British were at this point of time, they had become the bitter enemy for all the Indian masses. Now automatically, when they have a common enemy that they have to deal with, a common aspect which they were angered by, it automatically gave rise to the idea of oneness, to this idea that they belong to a common place which is dealing with common problems, which we will see that gave rise to Indian nationalism. As we had seen in the beginning itself, that when Madras famine had hit, there was this grand darbar that was held by Lord Lytton. So you can understand the concept of political policies that the British colonizers kept at that point of time was something that did not have the Indian masses in the picture. Not only were they not taken into consideration, but the British officers and the people who were appointed to govern India were doing the exact opposite than what was decided by Queen's proclamation. So we see that various colonial policies become the factors that also made the masses angry, and they were pushed to the wall basically. So we see the viceroy, who was Lord Lytton, and he became the viceroy from 1876 to 80. He became the face of these inhuman colonial policies at that point of time. So as we have discussed, that the repressive policies of India included that of the Grand Delhi Darbar that was held in 1877. Now this was the point of time when India suffered massively from the famine. So at this point of time, when Indian masses, Indian people did not have food, grains to eat, they did not have any means to eat, we see that the Grand Delhi Darbar is extravagant, where the celebrations are happening in such a mood that it would not feel that there is a colony that is dealing with something like that of a famine. Now, Lord Lytton was not, unknown to the fact that Indian nationalism was growing and it could, outgrow the control that British had. So, in order to repress it and nip it in the bud, we see that he passes the Vernacular Press Act in 1878, and this act was imposed as a policy to not only stop the Indians from speaking out, and not only was stopped so that the Indians could not report what was happening in the country, but was also seen as a method to curb down on the freedoms that Indians had as citizens of this nation. So we see that this imposed restrictions on the native press to prevent publishing of any negative news on the British government. So Vernacular Press Act was ideally to stop any sort of news to come out on the British government, whether criticizing it or not. There was nothing that was to be written about the British government, and this was done for only the native press sources that worked for reporting what was happening all across the country at that point of time. So we see that the British government also passed the Indian Arms Act in 1878, which prevented Indians from possessing arms without license, while Europeans never required such licenses. So you can understand the amount of discrimination that is exactly taking place between the two races, between the Europeans and the Indians. So on one hand, where Europeans are being given, the upper position of holding arms, in fact, by the Indian Arms Act, no native person could hold arms, and it was only the European people who were allowed. Whether they were officials or not, that was, unanswered, but the Indian native people were never allowed to have any arms on them, which was decided by the Indian Arms Act in 1878. The government also lowered the maximum eligible age from 21 to 19 years to sit for the civil service examination to discourage the Indians. Now this could be seen as a direct, deliberate attempt to challenge the acumen of the Indians. But how much the British wanted to impose the repressive policies on the Indians, the more the political consciousness grew. The Indians by now had understood that the British had in their minds the ideas of racial discrimination that found its reflection when the Ilbert Bill came out. Now, the mind behind the Ilbert Bill was Sir C.P. Ilbert, who was the law member of the Viceroy's Council, and this bill was supported by Lord Ripon, who was the then Viceroy. Unfortunately, the liberal Ilbert Bill was never implemented. Because when the Englishmen came to know about the creation of the Ilbert Bill, they immediately formed the Defence Association in protest against the bill. So primarily they did not want to give up their privileges which the bill was to curb down. So we see that Lord Ripon had to withdraw the bill. Now because the Europeans protested, unfortunately the liberal Ilbert Bill could never be implemented and it had to be withdrawn. So Indians, after this incident, became aware of the fact that
there was an amount of racial bitterness. So they became aware of the racial bitterness among the Europeans. They became united to fight for their rights. So when they understood that the Europeans had this idea of racial bitterness in them, they united for the national movement and they started to fight for their independence. Now this picture, this is a sketch from the graphic depicting a meeting of the natives in the town hall of Bombay in favor of the Ilbert Bill. The Delhi Darbar was not only held in 1877 but also in 1903 as well as in 1911. So you can understand, as you saw in the video as well, that the amount of extravagance and the amount of pomp that was put into the Grand Darbar was something that is not very realistic in terms of what the Indian people were dealing with. We have seen that the famine had reached to a level where people were dying of hunger. On one side, the people were dying of hunger, and on the other side, the political, policies and the political steps that the crown was taking, that the British government was taking, was contrary to what India was facing, and that angered the people because it showed the sheer reluctance on the part of the British government towards the Indian people, where they did not care about the dying masses, rather cared about the political achievement of the crown. Now, it is really difficult to understand certain things when we have not really gone through the changes. India only stepped into those changes when Western education came in. Now, India had, till a point of time been captured in the shackles of several social evils, several religious practices. But when Western education came in, there was an open-mindedness and there was certain changes that came through in the fields of primarily education. But these changes were only led and they were only possible in India when the reformers came forward to reform the social as well as the religious factors in India. Now, these factors also became the reason why nationalism had grown in these times. So, we see the first person
to become the face was Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Now Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was a staunch believer in the Reformation movement in India, was called the father of Indian Renaissance by Rabindranath Tagore for his amazing work in the field of Hindu religion as well as in the social changes that he propagated. So Ram Mohan Roy was also the person we see who deliberately worked towards the abolition of sati, and with the help of Sir William Bentinck, he was able to abolish sati. Not only sati, he also fought against various social evils like the caste system, the parda system, child marriage, as well as polygamy along with sati. So he played a prime role, as we saw, behind the abolition of sati in 1829. Now Ram Mohan Roy was a person who was born in an orthodox Brahmin family, but when he was introduced to Western education, that opened his mind and he was able to accept the changes with an open mind and heart. And Ram Mohan Roy also wanted to bring these changes not only in the social life of the people in India, but also in the religious aspects of Hinduism. So, in order to bring these changes, Ram Mohan Roy brought forward and established the Brahmo Samaj in 1828. Now, Brahmo Samaj propagated monotheism, that is the belief in one God, and also condemned idolatry or idol worship. Now, can you tell me when was sati abolished? Was it in 1830, 1826, 1829 or 1831? The answer will be 1829. So it was not just Ram Mohan Roy who propagated these changes, but we also see that Jyotirao Phule and his wife become the pioneers of these changes in Maharashtra. Now, Jyotirao Phule belonged from the lower castes and knew the amount of exploitation and discrimination the lower castes had to face during that time. So he tried to change the social structure and the way the lower castes were given the justice. In order to bring about a change, he worked with his wife Savitribai Phule, and he fought for the rights of the depressed classes in the Indian society. The instrumental change that he brought along with his wife was that he started the first school for girls in India in 1848. He was also a pioneer of the widow remarriage movement in Maharashtra. In Bengal, the widow remarriage movement was led by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, and in Maharashtra by Jyotirao Phule. He established the Satyasodhak Samaj to ensure that the lower classes got the justice they deserved and were not exploited by the upper classes. Now, as we were discussing the fact that it was not just Jyotirao Phule and Ram Mohan Roy who became the faces of this reformation movement, we also see Dayanand Saraswati, Annie Besant as well as Swami Vivekananda lead the way and bring about changes in the society as well as the Hindu religion. Dayanand Saraswati went ahead to establish the Arya Samaj that focused on Vedic Hinduism and the way Upanishads had stated about Hinduism. So Dayanand Saraswati, Annie Besant, Vivekananda and several others were the reason behind the Indian masses realizing that they had a history of themselves and this was a rich history. So this was the point of time when they realized that the Indian mindset had existed long ago, and with certain changes in the social values and the religious systems that existed, India could reach the zenith. So this was the point of time when these Indian people realized that they have their rights and they have their freedoms that they have to seek from the colonizers. And this, awakening saw the rise of the Indian nationalism that ultimately pushed the Indians to go forward and overthrow the domination of the British colonizers.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at deltastep.com or download the DeltaStep app to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly, learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.